We can hear the commandment in Leviticus in the first reading, and we can say, well, that's really cruel to have lepers move outside of the camp and to live apart from everyone else and so on and so forth. And these were laws from God. Leviticus is basically the book of the Bible that probably has the most commandments of the Old Testament all in one place. We have other odd commandments in the book of Leviticus. We have things like, don't trim your beard if you're a man. Don't eat shellfish. Worship on Saturday. All of these other things. You should wear, it commands the Israelites to wear certain types of clothing. And so some people attack the church with these. Some people attack Christians and say, look how weird these things are in the book of Leviticus. Therefore, because they're odd, we should throw out everything that God commands in the Old Testament or anywhere else. And so we have to answer that. We have to think about what do we believe about this, and because it's an important thing for us to know where we stand on this. And so what we recognize when we look at the Old Testament is that Jesus does away with some of the things in the Old Testament, the cultural types of laws. Jesus slowly does away with them and helps people understand that they no longer, because He establishes a new covenant, the old covenant doesn't bind anymore in the way that it did in the Old Testament. And we see Jesus elsewhere talking about and doing away with some of the dietary laws that governed the Jewish people. We see these things slowly. Jesus is helping us understand how to parse out the Old Testament and to recognize some of the things that were cultural and only belonged to the Israelites, while other things endure. The moral law, the divine law, the things that are there in the Old Testament, some of them obviously survive and still have hold over us today. How do we then decide also that God means for us to still not commit adultery? Is that St. Paul and the early church wrestled with this question. In the Acts of the Apostles, they have a council. They get together as the apostles and they ask this question. And they sit there and they debate back and forth. Do you have to be circumcised to be a Christian? The answer was no. You do not need to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. Later on in the letter to the Galatians, St. Paul talks about how he and St. Peter actually fought over the question of food laws and whether or not they still applied. St. Paul says in Galatians that he went and rebuked Peter to his face over and with regards to dietary laws, saying that they no longer applied. Peter was waffling back and forth. In the Acts of the Apostles, we see in Galatians, St. Paul, St. Peter, and the Apostles, that the church helps us understand what in the Scriptures continues to apply to us today and what does not. And that again reiterates the important thing about reading the Scriptures through the lens of the church. The church helps us understand how to interpret the Scriptures. And we recognize again in looking at these issues and others that there are people who are on both sides of most every question in the Bible. And it's only through the church that we get clarity on what and how to understand what we find in the Scriptures. And that if we don't turn to the church, if we don't read Scriptures through the lens of the church, then we get 40,000 different churches. Because everybody interprets Scripture their own way.